Welcome back to Loon's Leaves, y'all. Today we're talking about propagation. All right, propagation. What is it and why should you do it? Propagating simply means you're taking a smaller piece off of an already existing plant that you have in order for it to form its own root system so it can become a whole new plant. So why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you want some more plants in your house and you have a few favorites that you want to kind of spread out the wealth around your home. Maybe you have a friend come over and they compliment one of your plants and have some questions about it. Maybe they want to own one. You can give them a small cutting of your plant that has a good root system started so they can start their own indoor garden of sorts and maybe begin a love of houseplant of their own. So giving them as gifts, creating new plants. I also like to use propagation as a way of managing the plants that I have. So I have some larger growers in my home. I have a monstera. I also have a bird of paradise. And these plants can get to pretty big heights pretty quickly, or pretty wide pretty quickly. And so I found my monstera was outgrowing the spot in my home that I had placed it. And so I've been needing to take cuttings off of the plant periodically in order to keep it a more manageable size so it doesn't kind of overgrow in the space that I've given it. And then when people come over and compliment it, it's one of my most complimented plants, I can go ahead and say, here, take a piece of it with you. And then start your own little indoor garden with that. So I'm going to talk about how to propagate certain plants that are more common in the home, and then how you can go about doing that either through water propagation or laying them on top of the soil. Those are my two favorite ways of propagating. The first plant that I want to start with is a pothos, because I feel like once you propagate a pothos, you kind of have a good idea of how to propagate most houseplants from there on. So this is from our living wall in our home. And pothos really get to be beautiful with vining. They also grow to be quite full, I've noticed. So that's one of the reasons we picked it for the wall. Also, it's easy to cut down and manage if it were to fill the wall up too much. And that's because on the vines of this plant, there are what we call nodes. So there's a node right there. And there's also another node right here. These are these little bumps that are sticking up off of the vine, and that's where roots will begin to form if you place those in water. So cut right after the node grows. So if you were to propagate this plant, you could propagate it after any one of these nodes. You can see them all sticking up there. But you could cut right after that, right here where my finger is, and then you could place this whole chunk of the plant into water, and it would form a root system, hopefully. Now, there's not always success with water propagation. There's not ever going to be 100% guarantee that you'll have success with any propagating, but the odds are higher in my mind if you water propagate. That's where I've found the best success. And so this is a cutting of a pothos, same one from the wall, just in a different spot. And I cut the plant right, you can see right after the node, this is where I cut the plant. So there's nothing growing from there. You're gonna watch for growth coming from that node. So this root was once a node, and now it is a pretty substantial root system. I'll hold it against the wall so you guys can see it a little better. Pretty substantial root system. I mean, it's still going in there. And it's even starting to form secondary roots. So these little guys that are shooting off of the main root system are secondary roots. And that's what you're gonna look for when you go to repot your plant, are those tiny secondary roots. Because you don't wanna shock your plant in by putting it into soil too soon. You're gonna want it to have a good substantial root system like it did when you first purchased the plant or first acquired the plant. So secondary roots are key when you go for repotting. I'm gonna stick this guy back in the water for now. And there's lots of other plants that come with nodes, or have nodes, I should say. And one of those is syngonium. They have pretty similar nodes to that of a pothos. I don't know if you'll be able to see some in here because they're pretty low on the plant, but there are some nodes here on this stalk of the syngonium. This plant's name is also Jane. It has a name tag. It's named after my grandmother who gave it to me. And so there are some nodes forming on this syngonium. And so I could cut right after one of those nodes and then form a new plant by placing that chunk of the plant into some water and waiting for the root structure to start to form up. Peperomia also have some nodes. They're a little bit harder to see. They're kind of in hiding. Basically, after any time the plant stalks off into a new branch, there's a little baby node there. So you could cut the plant right here, put this into some water, wait for that root system to grow, and then plant that up when you think it's ready. Another plant that has really easy nodes to distinguish are philodendron. Now there's philodendron Brazil, they're kind of vining like pothos. Those will have nodes very similar to pothos. There's tons of species of philodendron. One of my favorite, if you can't tell, are monstera. So monstera is a type of philodendron. And monstera are really unique because monstera have aerial roots to them. So aerial roots are nodes that get pretty long and start to form a root system that is just one root, okay? So there'll be no secondary roots popping off of that aerial root. And that aerial root has sprouted from the plant and is growing in search of soil. So maybe the plant is feeling a bit stressed. That will tend to happen in climates that are colder. Or if the pot is getting a little smaller, then you might notice your monstera forming aerial roots. Aerial roots are completely normal. It's just the plant kind of searching for other places to grow. So if you use those, though, as an indicator for where to cut your plant, then you'll have the most success propagating monstera. So there were a handful of propagations in that jar. That wasn't just one, that was a couple. And I have some down here. This was an aerial root that was forming on the plant. So this one's kind of looking a little wonky. It's experiencing some root rot, getting a little fuzzy, but it also has this area here where it's forming roots. So if you want better success with your plants, maybe cut your plant so that way there's 2 or 3 nodes on that cutting, so it has a better chance of forming roots from at least one or not maybe more of those nodes. So there were 2 aerial roots on this plant, and it's forming some secondary roots of its own. I think I'm gonna wait a little bit longer on this one so the secondary roots get bigger, maybe the first roots get a little bit longer in order to pot it up into soil. But this guy's doing fairly okay for how much neglect I've been giving it. I tend to just throw these guys in water. You can do that and just let them be, kind of like I did with this, and saw how much it formed roots. Or you can change out the water. You're gonna have most success if you're changing out the water frequently in order to keep it clean and prevent root rot from happening. So that is philodendron, or more specifically, monstera. String of pearls, I took this cutting off of my string of pearls just before this video, also have small nodes. So here's my cutting of a piece of my string of pearls. This came from a really big, long string of pearls. I'll try to insert a picture if I can. And this is the small node here. There's also another small node right here. So I tried to pick a cutting where there were a couple different nodes where it could form some roots. And string of pearls are kind of unique because you could root them in water, but I find better success with laying them on top of some soil. So you can kind of coil them up, form a little bit of a circle, and then lay that on some soil, and then water that soil, keep that soil nice and damp, and then those nodes will start to sprout roots and then root into the soil itself. So maybe when you're propagating this, pick the pot that you want the string of pearls to be in. because it'll start to root in that soil if you have success. This is one of the ones that I haven't had as much success with as the philodendron or the pothos or the syngonium. So a little bit harder to propagate, but same kind of node system going on where you can propagate those from. All right, so let's say your plant doesn't have any nodes. What should you do? So something else that you can look for are what I call pups, or what are more commonly known as pups in the plant world. And things like pilea, or plants like pilea, have pups that will start to form. So pups just mean that there'll be a small plant that kind of pushes itself up from the soil. I like to say that they're propagating themselves. So if you see a small plant start to form, you can remove that plant or take that plant off completely out of the soil. So sometimes they'll just pull freely from it. Sometimes you might need to unpot the whole plant and kind of loosen up the root structure if it's entwined with the root structure of the mother plant. So that's what I call, or that's what we call as plant people, the main plant that the pups are forming from. So there is a very teeny tiny pup starting to form down here in the soil. So there's one. I also have some pups that I've been propagating. So I took it off of the mother plant, and they're kind of in this little, I use this as a propagation jar, or propagation station, I should say, for some other plants as well. It's pretty dry right now because I wanted to be able to have the ability to tip it in this video without it spilling everywhere. And these are some of the pups that came from that pilea there that I'm waiting to form a better root system before I go and pot them into a bigger pot or planter. Okay, so pups. Another plant that forms pups is a spider plant. So this spider plant pup is very old. It's actually been in here a tad too long, I think. It's formed some very sustainable roots. So look at that root structure. That's pretty darn good. That is definitely ready for soil, if not was ready for soil long ago. That has secondary roots, triary roots. Is that even a word? I'm not sure. It's got a very hardy root system. And this was a pup that I took off of my main spider plant here. My main spider plant has given us many pups, and even has one that I could take off now. So that's a smaller version of this big plant that's literally grown itself, and I can just cut it off, root it in some water. You never want to put it just right in the soil. So just pop it in some water, change the water out frequently. You'll have the most success with that. I do tend to neglect my propagations, but if you really want to have success, change that water out. Maybe rinse off the root system. Some of them can get a little bit slimy, and that can cause root rot because of the buildup that's happening on there. But it'll form a very hardy root system, and then you can go ahead and plant that up, and you have your own little baby spider plant. So those are the two that I can think of off the top of my head that really have pups that I own, or that kind of propagate themselves, as I like to say. And the other plants that I'm going to talk about are succulents. So succulents can be pretty easy to propagate as far as where to take the cutting from, because you simply just have to pull off one of the leaves. So it can be a little sad to pull off one of the leaves, but I'll try to take one of the middle leaves here. Or maybe one from the bottom, that won't be as noticeable. You take off one of the leaves, just pull it off gently. You can also do this with jade. So here is my jade plant that I've gotten from a friend. And here's jade. And I've actually pulled off a leaf, or a leaf fell off on its own and is just laying in here. And that's the perfect way to propagate a succulent. You just lay it on top of the soil, and I'll insert some pictures here, on what it will look like, because I don't have a lot of succulents in my home right now, and I don't propagate them often either. But when I do, I lay them on top of the soil, keep that soil nice and damp, just like you would for the pups or the string of pearls. And then, or you can spray them, keep them moist, and then they'll begin to form a small version of that succulent. So they'll start to sprout a little bit of roots, and then you'll see a small version of that succulent appear, and this main leaf will begin to die off. So if you start to see this shrivel up and kind of die, that's okay. That's what's going to happen to your succulent leaf. So this main leaf is going to produce a new succulent, and then it'll shrivel up and kind of die off. So that's what has happened to these two here. I propagated this guy, same way, taking off one of his leaves with that little curl at the end. They're so interesting. And then, as you can see in here, there are new plants beginning to form. So I'll pull this guy out and I'll put him back and we're done. So don't worry. But this is a mini version of that succulent. So it's not hairy yet in the center, doesn't have that orange center, and the leaves don't have that rippled effect yet. But this is a teeny tiny version of this guy who will hopefully grow into a nice hardy plant, and that came from this leaf that then shriveled up and died off. So that's how you propagate jade and other types of succulents. Just take a leaf, lay it in the soil, let it do its thing. Now, sometimes I find that the leaves will just shrivel up and die with no little succulent forming. I have a harder time propagating succulents and things like jade, so don't be upset with yourself if it doesn't work out the first time. That's why you might want to take a couple of leaves to give yourself better odds of propagating that beloved succulent that you have, or jade plant, whatever you wish, to begin with. So I would also, just like the string of pearls, consider succulents a more mid-level to hard propagation start. You're definitely going to have a lot more success with philodendron, pothos, things of that nature, or plants that form basically their own propagations, or pups, like the spider plant. Now, one of the more advanced ways I think there are to propagate your plants are through plant division, or taking a cutting from the plant when there is no node. So if you wanted to propagate something like an alocasia, I have a couple alocasia that I own, and there are no nodes on those plants, you can propagate them through plant division. So you're going to take that plant, unpot it, rinse off that root system, and see if you can pull apart two different plants. So that can happen for quite a few plants. You could do that on spider plants. You could do that on peperomia. Look and see where there might be two different root systems that you can take the plant from, and then make that one plant into two, or one plant into three, four, however many root systems you have. But on something like an alocasia, it might be a little bit more difficult to do that. So same with bird of paradise. You might have to look for that division, or you can sometimes slice the plant right down the center and cut that root system in half. However, then you kind of heighten the odds of not having one of those cuttings be successful. So you are taking a little bit more of a risk by propagating through root division. Now, for something like a snake plant, it can be hard to know unless you're doing a root division, or you are going to just simply cut the plant in half, on knowing where to propagate this plant. So I have been wanting to propagate my snake plant, and I don't really want to do that through root division. I don't want to take this plant out, and I don't want to slice it in half. I like how hardy it is. I like the size of it. And I found out that you can propagate this plant through taking a cutting of the leaf, somewhat like propagating your succulents. And in order to do that, you're going to cut the leaf that you chose into a V shape and then place that into water. So you're going to water propagate, and by letting it sit in the water, you're going to hope that a root system will form on this one paddled leaf that will be substantial enough to sprout off a new baby snake plant. So very similar to the process of propagating a succulent, where you're taking off that leaf in hopes that it'll produce a whole new plant through the root system. So I'm going to do that on camera today. I think I'm going to take this leaf here because he's a little wonky already. I was considering chopping him when I maintained my plants going into this winter time period that we have here in the north, and I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So taking him off, I know it's a little scary, with a pair of scissors that are clean and sanitized, and I see how I cut that V on the plant. So into the plant, that way it has a good chance. I guess this makes the chances higher of it forming a root system. I also heard that if you don't frequently change the snake plant's water, there won't be a high success rate in getting it cutting or getting a propagation from this type of propagating. And sometimes a slime can build up on that root system very easily because of the nature of the snake plant. It's much like an aloe, where it kind of secretes a slimy, sticky substance once cut because of its thick paddle-like leaves. And so that slime can build up on the root system and cause root rot. So I'm gonna place this in water, make sure I change the water out to be a little better about propagating than I have in the past. Change that water out, rinse off the root system every now and then, and I'll keep you guys updated on how this propagation process goes. Before, in the past, I've only ever seen people simply divide the plant, but I'm sure this will work out just fine, and we'll see how that goes. So that is propagation in a nutshell. I'm sorry if that was a little fast for you. You can always back up the video and relearn how to propagate certain plants. Those are just covering the propagation basics. So water propagating, that's mostly what we covered. Cutting at a node or cutting at a spot where you know the plant will sprout roots, placing that into water, waiting for a root system to form. You really want that secondary root system to form. It can be really excited once you start to see roots form and you want to plant it up, but you got to be patient and wait for that secondary root system. Or once you transition it into the soil, it's not going to do well and your really nice propagation could die off. There's also soil propagation, like string of pearls or succulents, where you're going to simply lie it on top of the soil, keep that soil and that propagation nice and moist, and then hopefully it'll form a root system that will be ready to plant up soon. Along with that, I think that just about covers everything. Now, you can expedite this process a little bit through something called Liquidirt. There's also other brands out there. It's something that you can put into the water that will act like a dirt or kind of like a fertilizer in order to promote root growth. Or you can use rooting hormones. So Liquidirt or rooting hormones can help expedite that process. So if you're a little bit more impatient, then there are other things that you can use in order to help you out. I'll have them linked below for you. So I hope you learned something from this video. I hope you feel a little bit more confident about propagating, and I hope to see some of your propagations online in the future, and you guys can...
Sorry about that, it cut off. I'm still trying to get it together with this whole editing thing. But thanks y'all for watching, and let me know if you have any questions via Instagram.